The missile crisis, one of the mongoose teams, these terrorist teams that Kennedy had sent into Cuba to smash the place up, one of them, which was apparently acting out of control at the time, like there's no evidence that Kennedy had ordered it to do this, but so maybe it was on its own, but one of them blew up a petrochemical plant in Cuba, which according to him, he doesn't verify it, but he says it's alleged, and he apparently takes it seriously, that 400 workers were killed. How does the U.S. get such enormous veto power? Simply take the realist position that Churchill articulated. The rich men and the rich societies run the show, and simply ask yourself, who are the richest men and which is the richest society? The United States is overwhelmingly the richest and most powerful society in the world by any measure. Economic power, military power, security, you name it. So, of course, it has the biggest voice. I mean, what could be more obvious? Except in terms from the point of view of the propaganda system, which naturally tries to efface the obvious. But if you think about it reasonably, what else would you expect to happen? Now, of course, it doesn't have to happen, but it'll only change if people inside the United States, which is also maybe the freest country in the world, do something about it. We're not living in Indonesia, I mean, we're not living in Iraq. It's easy to get here to change policy, but of course first you have to be aware of it and you have to want to change it and you have to do something about it. Otherwise it'll just go by the natural processes.
Recently there's begun to see a few public accounts. The UNESCO situation of 1983 in which the Western press accused the other nations of the world of attempting to destroy press freedom.
Right.
But that was really an attempt of the Western press, as is now being said, to retain its iron grip on the news of the world. Would you comment on that?
Yeah. Could you hear? He pointed out correctly that in, was it 1983, around then? 1983, yeah. Early in the 80s, the UNESCO called for what was called a new information order, and it came under bitter attack in the West, American press, government, intellectuals, and so on, still being attacked for trying to impose constraints on press freedom. And in fact, that's not what it was claiming. That's not what the new information order was calling for. What it was calling for was an end to the monopoly over global information on the part of powerful Western, actually tyrannical institutions, which is what the private media corporations are. That's what they were calling for. The fraud was exposed at once. There are very good academic studies of it. The best one I know is a book published by the University of Minnesota Press, edited by William Preston, Edward Herman, and Herbert Schiller. Careful academic study showing what the actual information order was, how the West reacted, how exposing the lies about it, very effective. Never reviewed, never discussed. The book's called Hope and Folly, and the attack on the UNESCO continues unchanged, just like the Revolution Without Borders. People like, say, Erskine Childers, a distinguished Irish diplomat who's been in the UN forever, has written about this, and others write about it, but without any ability to penetrate into our intellectual culture, which is remarkably, I mean, we don't live under tyranny, but the similarity to totalitarianism is pretty dramatic sometimes. War in the Balkans? Well, it's bad enough, but it doesn't compare with the usual consequences of the breakup of tyrannical systems. Like, it's nowhere near as bad as what followed the breakup of the Portuguese Empire or the French Empire and so on, but it's bad enough. I might say that even during the last few years, the war in Angola has been going on since 1985, and even in the 90s, the atrocities in Angola were worse by a long shot than the Balkans. So compare, for example, Sarajevo and Quito. Well, everybody knows about Sarajevo, huge coverage of Sarajevo, horror, crude Serbian peasants bombarding Sarajevo. It is an atrocity, and about 10,000 people have been killed. During the same years, about 25,000 people have been killed in Quito. That's just one town in Angola. And of course, they've been killed, and you can check to see how many index entries there are for Quito in the New York Times. They're being killed by the kind of person who's the wrong person to mention, namely by a person who was hailed as a leading freedom fighter in the 1980s and a great hero, namely the man who was running the contra-subversion that we were backing, that Basil Davidson, who I quoted, said would be cursed by history. So therefore, we better not talk about that one. But going back to the Balkans, it's bad enough. It's nowhere near other things, but bad enough. The reasons for it you can debate and argue, but I think it's pretty clear where it's going. U.S. policy has been more or less to Europe has wanted to quiet it down because it's dangerous for Europe. The United States also wants it to quiet down, not blow up into a regional conflict that might involve Turkey and Greece and harm U.S. interests anywhere. As long as it's contained, it's not a big problem for the West, and therefore the European powers have become involved in peacekeeping and relief operations. The U.S. refuses to become involved at all, except just to bomb somebody, but not do anything else. U.S. policy has been to keep it contained, and now that it looks like the kind of solution that Washington has wanted may be achievable, the U.S. is moving in to try to achieve it. That solution is a partition of the former Yugoslavia into a greater Serbia and a greater Croatia, Croatia being our ally, which is getting U.S. military support and aid and training. And it looks like that's what's happening. I mean, behind the facade of, preserving Bosnia and so on, it looks like what's emerging is a partition between Serbia and Croatia, in which there may be something called Bosnia, but mostly on paper. And now that looks feasible, Washington is indeed trying to move in to implement it, and there's some conflict now between the White House and Congress as to whether to even go that far. There are all sorts of reasons for this, and one could look into it, but I think that's the rough contours of it. This country depends what we do with it. This country has all sorts of advantages, all sorts of prospects, extraordinary wealth, tremendous amount of freedom, all kind of privilege. It is what you make of it.
What can I do to defeat this tyranny? Does voting matter? What matters? What can I do?
Well, just ask yourself what's changed anything in the past. We got a couple thousand years of history to look at. What individuals did never made any difference. What organized groups of people did made a big difference. That's why we don't have feudalism, we don't have slavery. In recent years, the civil rights movement is an example, the anti-war movements, solidarity movements, environmental movements, feminist movements, you name them, right in our own immediate history, they've made a big difference. When the labor movement has been the centerpiece of most struggles for social justice for obvious reasons, when people get together, even people who are poor and without power and privilege and so on, when they get together, they can do quite a lot. In fact, there's no limits to what they can do. But if they sit alone and ask, what can I do, nothing will happen. And it's not that there's any big secrets about this. We all know how to do it. If you're concerned with something, you ask, first of all, what it is. You find other people who have similar concerns. They usually exist right near you, and maybe they're even organized. You join them, and you do the kinds of things that will advance those interests and concerns in coordination with others. It can get to be huge mass movements. For example, let's say that we're the richest country in the world. Let's take the poorest country in the hemisphere, and ask how they reacted. Haiti. There is no country that has fewer opportunities than Haiti. It is just total. It was a very rich country, I should say. And a lot of Europe's wealth comes from Haiti, which was the richest colony in the world, and the U.S. took plenty of it too. But now it's a desert, practically. Well, a couple of years ago, people in the the poorest people in the hemisphere, in the Haitian slums and the hills, managed to construct, out of their own efforts, a vibrant